A short bio of Jean Batten. Jean Batten was one of the finest women pilots of the golden age of aviation. She brought great honour to New Zealand and a perfection to her flying that kept her alive through many frightening crises in the air. Utterly fearless, she sometimes took huge risks and flew in dangerous weather conditions, but she was an exceptionally accomplished navigator, one of the greatest international aviators of the 1930s. Jean Gardner Batten was born on the 15th of September 1909 in Rotorua, the only daughter of a dentist, Frederick Harold Batten, and his wife Ellen. She had two elder brothers, a third had died in infancy. Her mother, a tall, handsome woman, was a thwarted actress with strong feminist views. Domineering and possessive, she was obsessed with healthy living and instilled in her daughter nutritional habits that she was to embrace all her life. In 1913, the Batten family moved to Auckland, and at 5, Jean was enrolled at the ladies' school in Parnell. The family's life was disrupted by the First World War, during which her father served on the Western Front. With the loss of his earnings, they fell on hard times and were forced to live in a succession of cheap and shabby lodgings. Jean was moved to a state school. At an early age, Ellen encouraged her to become a high achiever in a masculine world, something Ellen had wanted to do herself. She also took Jean to Mission Bay to watch the Walsh brothers' flying boats, in which pilots were being trained for war service. By the time Fred Batten returned to Auckland in 1919, Ellen had grown used to being head of the house and was reluctant to relinquish the role. There were soon bitter quarrels, and around 1920 they separated permanently. Jean went to live with her mother, with whom she would develop a close and intense relationship. Funded by her father, she was sent as a boarder to the Ladies' College in Remuera, where she excelled, winning prizes in many subjects. Although she had now become a healthy and beautiful young woman, she acquired a reputation at the school as a loner, a highly intelligent, solitary person who few could warm to. At the end of 1924, soon after her 15th birthday, Jean enrolled at a secretarial school and began to study the piano and ballet with a view to performing professionally in both. However, in May 1927, her ambitions dramatically changed. Inspired by Charles Lindbergh's solo non-stop crossing of the Atlantic Ocean, she yearned to fly, an ambition that her mother encouraged. In 1929, Ellen took Jean to Sydney and arranged for her to fly with the Australian aviator Charles Kingsford Smith in his tri-motor Southern Cross. The experience made her more than ever determined to become a pilot, and a famous one, competing on equal terms with men. Early in 1930, having sold her piano to pay the fares, Jean sailed with her mother to England. She learned to fly at the London Aeroplane Club and gained her A licence in December. Almost immediately she began to plan a solo flight from England to Australia in an attempt to break the 19.5-day women's record set earlier that year by the English pilot Amy Johnson. As Jean and Ellen were then barely living on a £3 a week allowance from Fred, the goal did not seem immediately attainable. Jean therefore went back to New Zealand with her mother to raise money, but without success. She then returned to London alone to stay with her brother John, who had established himself as a successful film actor, starring in major features in Hollywood and England. Unfortunately, they quarrelled and Jean walked out. They never spoke to each other again. Hoping to attract a corporate sponsor, Jean decided to train for a commercial pilot's licence. To fund the 100 hours flying this required, she borrowed £500 from Fred Truman, a young New Zealand pilot then serving with the Royal Air Force. He wanted to marry her, but Jean had no intention of doing so. When she gained her B licence in December 1932, she simply walked out of his life, making no attempt to repay him. Instead, she turned to Victor Doré, the son of a prosperous English linen merchant, who was also infatuated with her. He borrowed £400 from his mother and bought Jean a de Havilland metal moth. In April 1933, Jean set off from England in an attempt to beat Johnson's time to Australia. It proved a frightening experience. Caught in a sandstorm over Iraq, she lost control and went into a spin. Recovering just in time, she landed in the desert and spent the night sleeping under the wing. The next day, she hit another sandstorm and was forced down again. On resuming her flight, she suffered engine failure and wrecked the aircraft trying to land near Karachi. Miraculously, she crawled out uninjured. Back in London, where she and her mother were now living in seedy bedsitters, Jean tried to persuade Doré to buy her another plane. When he refused, she simply ended the relationship. She had meanwhile turned to the Castrol Oil Company, whose head, Charles Wakefield, was impressed by her grit and glamour. He agreed to sponsor her, buying a second-hand metal gypsy. Jean, now engaged to the London stockbroker Edward Walter, set off in April 1934 on her second attempt to fly to Australia. It also ended in disaster. On the outskirts of Rome, she ran out of fuel in the dark and flew into a maze of radio masts. She was lucky to survive. Still refusing to give up, Jean had the Moth repaired and flew it back to England. She borrowed the lower wings from Walter's own aeroplane, and just 2 days later, on the 8th of May, she set out again. This time she made it to Darwin in 14 days, 22.5 hours, shattering Amy Johnson's record by over 4 days. Overnight she became a world celebrity. In Australia and New Zealand, which she visited by sea, Jean Batten was lionised. Rewards and lecturing brought sudden prosperity, and large crowds followed her wherever she went. She revelled in the adulation, impressing with her poise, beauty and speaking ability. In every speech she highly praised the support and encouragement of her mother, Ellen, to whom she had sent a much-quoted cable, "Darling, we've done it. The aeroplane, you and me." In Sydney, towards the end of 1934, Jean fell in love with an Australian airline pilot, Beverly Shepherd. When he proposed, she simply broke off her engagement to Walter, who was so angry he sent her a bill for the wings he had lent her. She flew the Moth back to England, becoming the first woman pilot to fly from England to Australia and back. In London she now began to move in the upper levels of society. Her achievements were saluted by the newspapers, and the international aviation community showered awards on her. In search of a new challenge, Jean made another spectacular solo flight. She bought a new cabin monoplane, a Percival Gull 6, and in November 1935 flew from England to South America. It was a brilliant feat of navigation. With only a watch and compass, she made the 1,900-mile trip from West Africa to Brazil with uncanny accuracy, establishing world records for the ocean crossing and the overall flight. She was the first woman to fly herself across the South Atlantic. In Brazil, Argentina and Uruguay, Jean was acclaimed by presidents, showered with gifts and mobbed by crowds. Newspapers dubbed her the flower of the sky. More honours followed. She won the Royal Aero Club's Britannia Trophy and, with Amelia Earhart, was jointly awarded the Harmon International Trophy for the most outstanding flight by a woman in 1935. She was to win it outright in 1936 and 37. Back in England, Jean and Ellen rented a cottage near Hatfield, Hertfordshire, and disappeared from public view. Not even their family in New Zealand knew where they were. The secretiveness of Jean's life had now begun to attract media attention, despite her brief appearance at Buckingham Palace for a CBE. However, in October 1936, she emerged from seclusion to make the longest of all her great journeys, the first ever direct flight from England to New Zealand. On the 16th of October, 11 days, 45 minutes after leaving England, Jean's Gull arrived at Auckland, where she was greeted by a very large crowd. But her phenomenal reserves of stamina were nearly exhausted. In the middle of a demanding lecture tour, she suffered a nervous breakdown. The tour was abandoned and she went off to recuperate. In February 1937, she returned to Sydney to be reunited with Shepherd. However, the day she arrived, he was sadly killed in an air crash. Her grief was profound. She and Ellen again went into hiding, staying at a Sydney beach for many months. It was not until October that Ellen persuaded Jean to get back into the air. She flew the Gull from Australia to England in 5 days, 18 hours, establishing a solo record for pilots of either sex. Jean was now 28. It was also her last long-distance flight. Quite rapidly she was to fade from public view. Unlike Amy Johnson, who was killed while serving with the Air Transport Auxiliary, Jean did not fly during the war. She offered her services as long as she could fly her Gull. But when this was refused, she declined to join the auxiliary. The Gull was requisitioned by the RAF, and Jean, after a few months as an ambulance driver, spent 3 years working on the assembly line at the Ordnance Factory in Poole, Dorset. Around 1943 she joined the National Savings Committee's team of lecturers, travelling Britain to raise money for the war effort. She was said to have been one of its most effective speakers. She also fell in love again, with an RAF bomber pilot identified in her unpublished memoirs only as Richard. They had apparently planned to marry after the war, but he was sadly killed on a mission over Europe. In 1960, Jean and her mother moved to Malaga and lived there quietly for 6 years, until in 1966, on a holiday in Tenerife, Ellen died in Jean's arms. She was 89. Jean became ill with protracted grief, declaring that she would not leave the island without her mother's bones, and now approaching 57. Tenerife was to be her home for 16 years. She kept to herself, typing her memoirs, swimming alone each day in the harbour and walking about the town. She claimed to have received 2 fresh proposals of marriage in her 60s and had a brief affair with a company executive in New Zealand, where she returned in 1977, with her hair now startlingly dyed blonde. In October 1982 she flew to Mallorca, where she intended to buy an apartment and live out her final years. On the 8th of November she wrote to her publisher. It was the last anyone was to hear from Jean Batten. She died in Palma, Mallorca on the 22nd of November 1982, aged 73. She had been bitten by a dog on her daily walk, and the wound had become septic, spreading infection to her lungs. She refused to let the staff of her small hotel call a doctor, and died quite needlessly of a pulmonary abscess. On the 22nd of January 1983, she had been buried anonymously in Palma Cemetery in a pauper's mass grave. During her life, Jean's superior skills made her a more professional pilot than her better-known colleagues. Behind her beauty lay qualities of ruthlessness and determination that were unique among her women pilot contemporaries. Although her intense relationship with her mother isolated her, Jean Batten's spectacular achievements owed much to Ellen's powerful driving force and skillful management of her daughter's life. Jean was one of the finest pilots of the golden age of aviation.